What's up everybody, this is Joe/WizzoCC, and this is an introductory tutorial on how to make a multiplayer game inside of Construct 3. We're going to be using the built-in plugin which uses peer-to-peer, and with that said, special thank you to all those who helped me playtest some of this before making this video. Really appreciate it, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump on in. Okay, so the very first thing that you should be aware of is on the Construct website, of course, they have some very nice documentation around their built-in multiplayer solution. I heavily recommend going through and reading this. It does take a little bit of time, but it really just barely scratches the surface of what you really need to know to be able to make a multiplayer game. You will have to do a lot of tinkering before you become comfortable thinking through how to adjust your brain to go from making a single player game to a multiplayer game. So definitely come in here and give it a read. It'll give you the foundation for understanding of what you need to do. The next thing you should be aware of is inside of this multiplayer, they actually have 3 built-in tutorials that you can pull up right from the editor. If you type in multiplayer in the editor, you'll see these come up. First is the basic chat room functionality, then a simple game of Pong, and then a real-time game. The game that we're going to be playing today and creating is actually a game built off of this real-time framework. So heavily recommend giving that a read, going through that as a foundation, watching this tutorial, and then going and making your own game. If you do enjoy this, please consider subscribing, giving me a thumbs up. Really appreciate it. It's free for you to do, and it makes a big difference for me. So with that said, let's dive into the Construct 3 multiplayer plugin. Do know that there are a lot of alternate solutions out there, Photon Real-Time, and a few others that you can dig into and think about using instead of this peer-to-peer solution, but this is a great start and it's free. Okay, so our game that we're going to be making today is called UFO Oddball. Let's give it a play. Alright, so the first thing is it asks you to log in with your alias, WizzoCC. Come in here and it says, oh, there's no open games in this region. Or any region, because we're currently the only player. So let's go ahead and host a game. This game is awesome. Alright, so it throws me into a game with a list of players, of which I'm the only one. And I can start, I can leave, I can come back here, host the game again, my favorite game again. And then I can wait for other players to join my game. So let's go ahead and pull up a second player and have them join. And there it shows, hey, I've got my game here. And I can go ahead and join it. I can host my own. You know, let's say I didn't want to join that game. I can say, this game is better, and host it. And then let's just say I was a third player that came and logged in, player 3. And you know what? I'm going to go with this game is better. Let's join that one. Okay, and you can see here that I've now joined the game with player 2. Notice that because I'm not the host, I can't start it, but player 2 sees player 3 and they can actually start it. Let's give this a start. You can see a countdown occurring on both screens. We've got our game timer. We've randomly spawned. Oh, and it looks like somebody has actually joined, so that's hilarious. I appreciate X for joining, and I bet they don't know that they're in my video right now. But anyways, so you can come in here and you can see that this game is actually going on. Here we go. We got some live testing going on. Appreciate it, X. And what you can do is you can see here is that, hey, look, if somebody dies, that respawn timer comes on. You come over here and you die from hitting the meteors for too long. You respawn. Your camera goes to this UFO. And the basics of the game is that you are hoping to come over here and grab this UFO and see how long you can hold on to it. And that's how you get points. And whoever has the most points at the end of 5 minutes wins the game. Or if you get to 100 first, you also win the game. So that was funny that X joined on that. I bet he doesn't know he's going to be in my YouTube video. But anyways, that's the basics. So let's go in and see how this is made. So we're back to our game layout here. Now, what I want to tell you is that we're going to organize this, and this is a fairly long video, so I apologize now. I will try to put links down below as to the different sections of the video so that you don't have to watch the whole thing if you only want to see certain parts. Okay, everybody, so this is going to be the framework of the tutorial. There's 3 main event sheets: login, message log, and game. Game being by far the largest of the 3. Login is what we saw in the beginning of the game, where it handles that flow with all the different screens involved. Message log is very simple. It just keeps track of messages and chats that are going on between either logging or a chat coming in from another player. And then the game is where we do all of the decision making once you're actually inside of the game. It handles the lobby in the beginning, and then it initializes the game. It passes that information between the host and the peer to make sure that you're looking at the same world. You have to have a section on signaling, which involves setting up your multiplayer plugin and which objects you're going to sync and how often you're going to sync it and with what resolution. You also have to handle disconnects and errors between peers joining and leaving. The game also then is kind of broken into 3 specific groups that you have to make sure you have the context in mind when you're making your game. And this is what I found really tricky. So in a single player game, you often are just thinking about you, yourself, and I, and what data you need to have to make the decisions to make the game work. But in this, you have to think about it from 3 different contexts. You have to think, am I a peer? Am I the host? Or am I common? And I need to work on both. So with that said, you have to think about your features and how you implement them so that usually the host is authoritative in terms of the decisions that need to be made, and it's passing that to the peer. The peer is providing inputs to the host, and then there's certain things that you need to do across both the peer and the host. So whenever you're implementing a feature, it does become much harder to think through how you're going to do that, which takes some time to get used to. So if you're the peer, you have to make sure that you handle as objects are created, aka the host is syncing them and it's creating it on the peer if it doesn't exist. What do you do with it? You also have to pass information from yourself to the host, and that's the client update data section. And then you have to simulate local control so that the lag doesn't seem as bad, while also the host tries to keep all the positions in sync. You can simulate local control to make it feel smoother. And then also you have to handle these on-peer messages, which the host is providing you. Maybe it's trying to trigger a Boolean, or maybe it's trying to set a specific variable. You have to have some of your host messages get passed to the peer, and the peer has to respond to it appropriately. Inside the host, you're doing a lot of things. You're handling the peer connection and what to do when they do connect. You're doing all the movement and input control. And then I have this section called Host is the Boss. It is the one that decides, well, who got hit, who scored points, who won, who lost. It's the one that gets to decide and then relay that information to the peers. And we also have some helper functions in there to help us do all that. You have to handle points and death and respawn in the host. And then there's the overall game loop that the host is in charge of. When did it start? When does it end? And then also it's responsible for relaying chat messages between the peers and also any effects. Underneath the common, I mean, this is some of the less fun stuff. You have to do some of the initialization. You have to handle like visibility of layers or objects or sprites. Make sure that the animation frames are all set correctly. Any global variables that need to be reset. You're doing message logging for the users. You're handling certain objects in a specific way that's common between the two. And then also you need to make sure that you have like leave buttons and other UI elements, and then also the minimap. All right, so that's the agenda. Hopefully that gave you good context of what all is needed inside of a multiplayer game, even as simple as this one. So let's go in and start with login. So inside our login event sheet, there's a few things going on. First is you have to have at the top, you're keeping track of some global variables, including your alias/username, your game name, which typically is like your studio, then the name of the game, and then the version. And that lets you make sure that if you have a new version, no peers are playing on different versions that would cause bugs that you haven't checked. Then you have an instance name, which I'm using for regions like NA, EU, and Asia. And then room names, and that's what the host is creating, and that's what they're calling their game. All right, and then this is just a check that we use to make sure that the host is not making a game that already has the same name that somebody else has made. So when you come in here and you start the layout, there's a couple things you want to do. First, you want to know, am I already logged in or am I not? That's the main thing. This is just some initialization. And if you are logged in, show one screen, aka jump right to the game list. If you are not logged in, type in your alias and hit enter and then go to the game list. And that's what these two sections of event sheets do. I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly because this is a massive amount of content, and I'm going to post all this up on my itch page so that you can go through it at your own pace and really digest the event sheet. I just want to give you a feel for the flow of how this all works. Okay, so if you are joining for the first time and you need to type in your alias, you need to make sure that you have something in there before you hit the connect button so it's not just empty. And when you hit the connect button or hit enter, it goes ahead and sets your username, connects to the signal server, and the signal server is what allows you to find the other players. And that's an important thing that you have to realize, is that Construct 3 is providing this to you. You could have your own if you want to set it up, but this is what's available for free. Also, there are other solutions besides the Construct 3 plugin that you can use outside of this entire plugin, such as Photon Realtime, etc. But we're focusing on what's provided built into Construct 3 in this tutorial. So you've connected the Signal server. We're actually automatically going to log in with your alias. And then once you're logged in, you get to do a couple fun things. You go ahead and you hide that one screen and you pull up the room list. And when you pull up the room list, we're going to set the default to North America as the region. And then once we do that, we're going to request our room list. This is an important thing. And when you request a room list, we're basically asking, give me a list of all the rooms, aka games, that are inside of this instance as part of this game. So you kind of have like 3 tiers. You've got your game, which you can have different versions of, right? As you make new updates. You've got your instance, and then you've got your room list, which is your individual games that are being hosted. So you get that list at the bottom tier there, and when you get it, you want to display it to the user, which is what's going on here. When you go through it, I have some things that basically say, hey, if there are no games, do some things that basically tell them, look, there's no open games in this region, host your own below. It still sets up all the different graphics, and it does some color coding on the tint. But really, this is just, hey, make your own game, nothing's available. If there are games, this is where there is a little bit of a trick. So we're going to loop through however many rooms there are, or however many games there are, and we're actually going to use this pinning to a panel effect, where we're setting up these UI elements that are spaced accordingly, and we're pinning it to a panel. And that panel is this right here. And one of the things that's kind of cool, though, is that as you pin it, we have this mask that is actually at the very top layer that you can't see. It's at the top there and at the bottom here. And what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to click and drag, or drag and drop, or use this little bullet functionality to give it a scrolling effect, so that it will actually keep itself contained in this little box right here. But you can have this really, really long list. That's a little trick that you can take a look at when you digest the code in your own time. All right, so let's go back. We've now presented the list to the user. We give them this little functionality to click on these dots and move which one you've selected. As you move what you've selected, we're setting certain things, aka what's the room that you've selected. And then at any point when you hit join, that join button, it's going to use what you've selected as the join command. So that's what this is handling. And you also have to make sure that you're managing your layers as you do this. So you want to make sure that the dot is at the top of the layer as you're creating things, because I have this in a container, and you want to make sure that it's always kind of coming through appropriately. So you can see this is a container that I've got set up here. So it spawns all of them at the same time. Okay, so this is just a little check to make sure that we didn't make a game that is already being used by somebody else, a game name. If it does, it gives an error. It says must be a unique name. Otherwise, it lets you, host your game. So when you do go and touch these different shadows, it's moving this, select dot around, and it's setting your game name to what you've selected. And then similarly, this is the region, and this is the room. So if you select a different region, it'll actually call, hey, give me that list again, but for that different region. So if I select EU, give me the EU list. If I select Asia, give me the Asia list, and so on. And then I also have this little refresh here, which I set up initially, which was, hey, every 4 seconds, let's refresh the list in case somebody hosts a game. Let's get every 4 seconds, let's refresh it and see if people are hosting new games. All right, so let's go on down. Now we've got this next section, which is if I am typing in, my host game name, let's go ahead and being able to hit enter and, go ahead and jump into that game by hosting it. So when you do that, what happens is it goes through this check, all right, first and foremost. And once it goes through that check, let's come back up here. So it calls this room list, and it goes through this check, and it says, let's go through, and if I find a conflict, nope, you're out. If I don't find a conflict, you're good to go, and let's go to game. And that's the next layout, and we'll jump into that in a moment. But let's just cover a few more things. All right, so that's go ahead and hosting, and then similarly, there's a join button that basically says, hey, if I have hit the join button, let's go ahead and jump to game. So you can see the trigger to jumping to game is what is actually going to signal the command to try to join it. So let's go ahead and jump over to our game layout. So our game layout, I have some UI elements that are all laid out on top. Let's also jump back real quick to our Miro board and make sure we covered everything. So we did connect to signal server. We talked about login. We talked about instance and regions. We talked about room lists and this scrolling panel. And we talked about hosting and joining. So let's briefly jump over to message log so we stay on agenda here. Okay, so inside of our message event sheet, it's really simple and it's directly from the tutorial, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But whenever we're calling this this add chat or this add log, we're utilizing an array that is capped at 20, and we're pushing it into there, and then we're really just displaying it in this log text, every element that's in that log. And that's what happens every single time you decide to call this. It will, update this array and then display it in the text for each peer. All right, so now we're going on to the game. So we've got the lobby, handling players, initialization, and world/map. So let's go through those right now. Okay, so we're back in the game. As you can see here, I kind of went layer crazy just because I wanted to make sure I was setting everything appropriately. And one of the things I found, and it talks about this in the tutorial, is you have to constantly, every tick, make sure that certain elements that you're trying to sync are on the appropriate layer, because sometimes they get a little bit out of whack in terms of which layer they're on. So I just went super layer heavy to make sure I could always be in control of what layer something was on. Now, this is our little lobby screen here, and it's really just a simple panel. I've capped my number of players to always being 4, which made the code a little bit simpler. And I've got some other UI elements here, and I've got my peer, some effects, and some other sprites all hanging out here. This is my log text where we were just talking about that gets populated. And here's a little input for you to be able to chat with your friends, and a little leave button if you want to leave the game. And in the top right's a little mini map. So going back to our agenda, let's start with the lobby. That's what it looks like. But let's look at the event sheet and see what we're doing here. The first section, let's talk about signaling. So on the start of the layout, remember we haven't requested to join the room yet. So we still have to do that. When you start the layout, you actually have to set up a whole bunch of stuff for your multiplayer, and then we're going to also then join the room. All right. So the multiplayer plugin requires you to set up these client input values, and you can put the precision level that you want in terms of what you need. And for the most part, you don't ever need high, but maybe you do. But for me, low is totally fine. I don't care if it's not to the 8th decimal place. I mean, an integer is totally fine for this. And then I have interpolation as linear. And this helps the game know how to compensate for lag as it's communicating back and forth. So I have look X and look Y. This is taken directly from the tutorial for the real time. And this is really just where your cursor is. And then there's inputs. And this is an important one. So what this is, we're using just the uint8. And this gives us 8 bytes to toggle 0 and 1. And what we're going to use is WASD, spacebar, and left click. So that's 6. We still have 2. So we can use this uint8 and use that for 0 and 1 that we're going to be passing from the peer to the host and making decisions with. And then we have these sync objects. So we have this sync peer, which we're doing the position only. And we're using precision here for norm. We're going to use normal. And then we're using normal bandwidth. And typically, I think you can pretty much leave almost anything on normal, and I think it'll automatically actually try to go from 30 frames per second down to 2 if you don't need it, like if it's not moving. But for our players, let's do normal, and it will update roughly every other frame. And then we have these sync variables, and these are all instance variables on our peer. And this is really convenient, and you can use this in a lot of clever ways to help pass data between your host and your peer by making this stay in sync. So when a host makes a decision on something like this person hit this person, you can populate an instant peer, and then that'll actually sync to all the players. So that's one of the tools that you have in your tool bag to solve certain problems, is to use this syncing of an instance variable on your peers. And I did that for a whole bunch of them here. And then I also have some of my effects get synced. So if a host says, oh, you know what, spawn this explode or this laser explode here, it passes all that to all the peers, and it also spawns, in the same spot, an explode or a laser explode. And then I've got this UFO, which I'm actually not syncing any position because I wanted to handle the positioning of that in a separate way, because it looked laggy when I was doing this because this is something that the players can interact with and they can click and drag around. And I wanted it to look more fixed to the spaceship rather than always slightly, following it because of this attempt to sink it into the position. So really, I just want it, if I create the object, also create this. And I will then handle the movement of this and where it is showing up on the screen in a different way. And then finally, we join the room. So if you are the first person in, you automatically become the host. So when you go ahead and hit your, hey, I'm going to be the host, enter, boom, join my favorite game, you're the first one in here. And so it goes through this on the start of the layout, and you join this room, and it says, here's my room name for this game and this instance, and we're setting the max peers to 4. And now you're the first one in. All right. And then you have to handle some other things that are part of the signaling aspect of the multiplayer. So you want to hey, if I've joined the room, let's call this log. There's also signaling disconnected, which you can use. There's signaling error, signaling left room, and unkicked. And these are all things that you can use to trigger certain events. For me, really, it's just calling the different logs, and then I have this go to login on the signal error and on the unkick. So if you're somebody that was a peer and you got kicked by the host for whatever reason, or there was some signal error, it kicks you back into the lobby where you can go and try to find a new game. Let's see how we're doing. So we talked about really just the signaling piece, and we did not talk yet about handling players and initializing the world map. So let's go back and start there. Now we're inside of this game block, which is kind of meaty. So there's the peer, the host, and common, and that's how this is organized. Remember, we have to keep this frame of mind of, am I making an action for the peer? Am I making an action for the host? Or am I making an action that really should be for both? And you have to keep that in any feature that you implement. You have to think about where am I going to put each of my events, and how am I going to pass the data, whether it's from the peer or from the host, or how do I display things appropriately on either. All right, so let's go in, and for how we've set this up, I think it's probably better that we start with the host. So let's go there. So on the start of the layout, I have something that I would say is an okay scheme for handling players joining and leaving. I just set these brute force Boolean of P2, P3, and P4 available as like slots. And I basically, as people joined and left, I said it's either true, it's available, or false. And you might want to give your players the ability to like switch positions or switch colors or anything like that. And my system doesn't really accommodate for that. But this is a simple tutorial, so feel free to implement that in your own games. On peer connected is a very important event. So basically that's when somebody decides, hey, you know what, I'm going to join your awesome game. And they jump on in, and you want to do a number of things as the host. First is you want to create this object which they're going to play, peer. And when you create that, because you set it up to be synced up here, what will happen is it will automatically create that for each peer as well. So when you set it up, though, you want to make sure that you initialize it correctly and it passes all that appropriately to each peer. So when you come down here, there's some things we want to do. The very first thing you want to always do is make sure that you assign this peer ID. And this is going to be super helpful in writing conditions. And you get this from the multiplayer.peerID. And this will allow you to differentiate between the players, is always keeping track of this peer ID. So when you are a host, you can say, well, this player is trying to hit this player, and you can use that variable to differentiate. I'm also doing some initialization around, some of the other objects that get spawned with it as a container, and where to position them, and how to add it as a child, and the visibility. But this is an interesting one. So I also broadcast this seed message. And I then also broadcast this UFO. And I also do this player dead states and this broadcast. And so what I'm doing here, and I'll talk about what each of these are attempting to do in the game, is the host is also sending a direct message out to all peers that the peers can respond to. So it's saying, hey, send out this message called seed, and the value I want you to send is this variable that I've called seed. And similarly, I'm doing it for this UFO, and I'm passing this dictionary that I've set up as JSON to the peer. And this is a really easy way to pass information back and forth. So if you've got a dictionary or some other data structure that you want to share with your peers, especially like when they join, you can do all that using this broadcast message command. And this is a really important way outside of the syncing of instance variables to also pass information to your players from the host. So obviously when a person joins, there's probably a few things that you want to send them to get them up to speed as to where the game is at or what initialization the host has chosen. Okay, so let's talk about how this map is actually being created when the host joins, and then how each peer creates the map by using the same seed. Alright, so inside of this signaling section, all the way at the top, it's just a convenient place to put it. It also checks, are you the host or are you the peer? And this is an important step that I kind of skipped over that's part of the signaling block, which is it right away tells you, okay, if you're the first person in, do all these things, and let's set that group host active, right, rather than the peer. And then if you're the peer, let's set that peer group active rather than the host. And then that way, if you're the peer, you're only using events in there, and if you're the host, you're only using events in there, and then they both use the events inside of the common. Now, this is kind of a convenient place to initialize a whole bunch of stuff. So if you do join as the host, I'm doing all this initialization for the host peer, and then also some world building and other data creation that I'm going to pass to the peers when they join. So one of the things I'm doing right away is I'm setting this seed to advanced random.random seed, and I update my seed to that accordingly. And then I'm going to call this generate space map. Great name. All right, so let's go and go on down to that. So generate space map. Okay, and so in this generate space map, I'm actually taking advantage of a few things. Link up above to an introductory tutorial that I did on procedural generation, and it covers the basics of how to make use of those noise textures from the advanced random plugin, like classic 2D, which is the Perlin noise, cellular 2D, billow, etc., combined with some other clever uses of blocks and tiles to make a whole world. This takes some of that and it uses it to determine where I should put some meteors, and it makes this cool clustering of meteor effect, which I was pretty happy with and how it turned out. Feel free to dive into this and take a look, but I'm not going to focus on it in this tutorial. So I'm the host and the peers connected, and I've passed this seed. Now they can generate the same world on their side. It's not like I'm creating 7,000 meteors and then attempting to sync all 7,000 meteors to all the peers. I am just passing a single text value that then they use to create the whole world themselves as well, which is kind of a cool thing. And then I'm using also the same strategy to make sure that the UFO position is in the correct spot for them when they spawn, because like I said, I'm not syncing the position of that. I'm handling it through messages and a couple other things, but suffice it to say, I'm broadcasting this UFO data as JSON, which is one of my data structures, keeping track of a few things. And then also this player dead state. So this is in case you join the game and it's already started. I wanted to have a way of double checking really quick, hey, who should I show as dead, and not have them just sitting there not being able to be controlled. I wanted to look like it was for everybody else, even if you joined mid-game. And that's what this data will allow them to do. And I broadcast that to the peer. All right, so we're going to go, and we've talked about this now. We talked a little bit about peer. Let's go into these sections, and we'll come back to the peer. So movement, input control, and the host is the boss. Let's talk about that. Movement and input control is something that the host is primarily responsible for. So the peer is passing these 0 and 1s, right? And they're doing some local movement on their own to make it feel less laggy. But ultimately, it's the host's responsibility to determine this is where they really are, and this is how I'm going to make decisions. So what it does is it says, first and foremost, if the peer ID is multiplayer.myID, aka this is me, this is my peer, my player, then I'm going to go ahead, and even though I technically don't need these set bits of 0 and 1 to move my person, I'm still going to populate them because I'm going to use it in logic later on for some certain events that I want to do on both the host and the peer. So similar to the peers, I actually set this input variable to a 0 or 1 depending on if the WASD or arrow keys are down, if my left button is also down, my mouse click, and then also the space bar. And I also have this check here that if you're in the text box typing, I want to make sure that I'm forcing all the inputs to 0. And then what I can do is, rather than use these directly, I'm actually then coming through and saying, okay, if it is equal to 1, simulate 8 direction pressing left. And it talked about this in the tutorial. You want to make sure that you're using the simulate on the 8 direction rather than the default controls, because then it will try to move like all the piers at once, I think. So make sure you're using the simulate, and then you can specifically for each pier use their own inputs to simulate pressing left, up, right, down. Okay, now that's for your own player. Now, if it's not your own player, aka is not equal to my ID, you loop through each pier, assuming the game is started and the person's not dead, and it does a few things. First and foremost, it will set the pier's look at X to the value that you got from the client input of look X and look Y, and also the inputs. And then once you have those inputs, what you can do is you can say, okay, for each pier, if my input is 1, simulate left, up, right, and down. And that's how it's being moved. And then that's what's actually getting synced back to the pier on where their position is. They're trying to do some local movement, but the game will actually attempt, the multiplayer plugin, to slowly correct as much as possible, keep them aligned with each other so there's not some big jarring movement all of a sudden where it self-corrects. All right, now host is the boss. All right, this is a group of items where you have to decide certain things. Like I've tried to shoot a laser at you and I want to know that I hit you. Well, the host gets to decide that, not the peers. So the host is responsible for figuring this out, and so what they'll do is the host will do is it'll loop through each pier, assuming the game is started and the pier's not dead, and it does a few things. One is it helps with setting this moving angle thing, which for me, I needed this because I wanted, versus the tutorial where it was just the look at X and look at Y would just define where the angle was. I have like this turret on top of my spaceship, which might be a different angle than I'm moving from 8 direction. So I actually had to sync an additional variable called moving angle, so I could show that separate than what I'm looking at, which is my little turret that's going to shoot the lasers. It says, okay, I've got my peer input 4 equals 1, aka I've left clicked. I need to then go and do some checks. And it does this first shot so that you aren't just constantly every tick checking it. It simulates this Boolean, which you have to use something like this rather than check once, because otherwise it won't work in this scenario to do that type of check once. So you have to make sure you use this Boolean on the instance variable to only trigger this test hit once. Otherwise, every single tick it'll try to do this. And then it calls this test hit. And it uses some helpers here, which the tutorial covers, on why it uses a family called aim spot UID rather than the sprite itself. And it's just so that you can keep track of things appropriately. So aim spot UID and firing peer ID is what's passed. And you come in here and under helper functions, they've got this test hit. You've got this aim spot family that you can pick. I'm going to create this laser explode effect, which the host is doing, and then that's going to sync to all the peers. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, okay, I'm not the one firing it. I'm going to loop through each peer that's not me, that isn't dead. And I'm actually going to do something kind of tricky here. I'm going to take old X, old Y, old angle. I'm going to populate it to the current peer position. And then I'm actually going to set the position back in time to where the current player sees themselves based off the lag. And I will check for a hit in that case. Hey, if I fired and I saw that my cursor was right on you when I fired, I expect to get a hit. This helps ensure that you are doing something like that. And basically I have it is if it's overlapping, that laser explodes, subtract 20 from health, and keep track of who was the last hit. In case it happens to kill them, it increases my kill count that, hey, I got the last hit on you. Okay, and then it sets the position back. That's an important thing. It sets the position and the angle back to where it was after it does that check. So the host, it doesn't see them like, shoot over or anything. It's all done inside the same tick. All right, and then we've got this other input, which is our mouse bar. And this is what is used to pick up the UFO, and that's actually how you win the game, is the longer you can hold on to the UFO. And UFO Oddball is kind of my take on like Halo Oddball, if you remember that game. And it's basically the longer you can hold onto the UFO, the more points you get, and whoever has the most points at the end of the game, or if you get to 100 first, you win. So if you're holding down spacebar and you're within a certain distance of the UFO, you will be able to grab it, add it as a child so it moves around with you. It populates some data and it passes it back to the other peers so they also know. And then they also can update the position of their UFO accordingly. And that's how I'm passing the information for where the UFO is, rather than with the sync object. Because I thought this looked better for the gameplay experience. So I've got this dictionary here. It broadcasts it as JSON. The peer can do something with that to basically show it in the correct position on their side. And then it starts this timer where, hey, every 1 second, it's going to add a single point. And then it also slows the player down and makes them easier to hit. So if you're carrying the UFO, I guess you have to go slower. And then when you drop it, it goes back to 800. So going on down, I also have this check here where every so many seconds, I think it's like 0.1 seconds, I actually check every single peer, and if they're over a meteor, it does damage. So I have this call test meteor damage, and if you look here, it will go and basically say, hey, I thought about doing something similar to the move the X back, old X, old Y, and I ended up not using it. But basically I went through and I said, hey, if the peer is overlapping a meteor, subtract 10 minus the animation frame from the health. And that's only because I had the animation frames set up in such a way that it's from biggest to smallest. So bigger meteors do more damage and smaller meteors do less damage. That section. So host is the boss. We're getting through it, guys. I know this is a long tutorial, but multiplayer is a complicated topic. I thought about doing multiple videos, but I was like, you know what? I'll just do one big one and link all the different locations of the pertinent subjects. So let's go on now to points, death, and respawn. All right, so inside of here, it's the adding of the point that we talked about is going on here. And then similarly, if the person has less than 0 health, then toggle it to dead. And then also broadcast that out to all the other peers so that they can show on their UI like, hey, put a big red, spaceship here and signify, hey, the person's dead. And it's also going to show their respawn timer on all the different clients. And I also have this extra dictionary I'm populating just to help in the situation where somebody rejoins and another player happens to be dead. It lets them figure out who's dead right when they join. And then we've got on respawn. So when the player does die, a couple things also down here. If you happen to be carrying the UFO, you drop it, and also your camera is removed from you. And this is what the scroll to behavior is attached to, is this camera. And it will actually move it over to the current UFO position. So if somebody's moving it around, you'll follow along with it, and you can see what some of the action looks like while you're waiting to come back. And then, also, like I said, you drop the UFO if you die. Going on down to this respawn timer. When the respawn timer triggers, trigger this broadcast alive message, and that will let all the other peers know, hey, the person's come back. So, show the, update all the UI elements that you need to update, and trigger, the state of that peer from dead to not dead. And it spawns them in a random location, resets their health, updates that dictionary, and broadcasts it out again so that everybody has the most recent information. And then it attempts to make sure that the camera goes back to the player and not stay on the UFO. And then you can keep on, and then also this little respawn timer here, if it's running, just show the timer appropriately next to the person that died, so hey, in 8 seconds, 7 seconds, 6 seconds, this person's coming back. All right, doing good. Game loop, I believe, is next, right? Yep, okay, good. I was a little bit more organized this time. All right, game loop. So this is really just where we're handling some of the flow of the games. The start, the end, and all the triggers that you need for it. So when the host, and only the host can do this, we're in the host section, hits the start button, it shows a little countdown timer, it broadcasts it to the peers so they can also see, hey, game starting in 3, 2, 1. And it goes ahead and disables it. And then when that countdown timer is over, it says, hey, the game has started. Use this to true. Set this to true. Toggle some visibility of certain panels and UI elements so that everything looks appropriate. And it broadcasts that game start message to all the players so they can do the same thing. And then I have a few things once, if the game timer is running. Well, I'm actually going to put the game timer onto the peer that is my host. So multiplayer.myid, remember I'm in the host group. So this will respond to only the peer that is the host. And I'm going to put the actual value of that timer as an instance variable. And this allows me to sync that instance variable to each of the peers who can then use that to check, if this is the host, peer and I'm looking at this game timer, I can use this to show how much countdown time is left. And I found that to be a better method than trying to say like, hey, I've started the game, each of you kick out your own timers, because they get out of sync and different weird things happen. So I suggest using this method for passing the game timer to all the peers. And it also does linear interpolation on the instance variables, so that's helpful as well. Then you've got another thing here is, hey, if your score is greater than or equal to 100, so rather than it getting all the way to 5 minutes running out, if you manage to get to 100 before that, the game is also over. And you're going to send that message over to all the peers, and it's going to do some screen handling because the game's over. I want to pop it up, say who the winner is, only show the color of the winner, make everything else grayscale, and go ahead and turn off the visibility of the UFO so that you can't really interact with it anymore. The game's over. I do allow the players to still move around and kill each other one more time, but they won't respawn. And then similarly on the game timer, it does the exact same thing, and it displays the winner based off of who has the highest score. If there's a tie, I think it just picks one randomly. I didn't try to handle that event, but feel free to in your games. So we got through a lot there. We got through the game loop, and then the last two are really simple: relay chat and effects. So really, this is super simple. Basically, on the relay chat, we say, hey, on a peer message chat, broadcast that to everybody else as well, so that everybody gets the message. Remember, you're the host, so if it comes from the peer, it goes to the host and then back down to all the different peers. And then effects, this is, I'm only handling if the explode or laser explode come up. Once it goes through its animation, just destroy it. And by you destroying it, it will sync all the other peers to also similarly destroy it. So that is the host. And that's a bear of a section, so thank you for getting through that with me. And I do hope that this is useful for you to hear me talk through this, because it was a struggle for me to put all this together and think through it on my own. There's probably some ways that you could do this a little bit more effectively, but this is how I approached it. Also, remember, this is going to be on my itch page. Remember, link in the description. And remember, also, if you happen to not have subscribed and you are enjoying this and you're still watching it, maybe give me a thumbs up. I appreciate it. All right, let's keep going. Back to our lesson plan. So we're going to go now to peer. And peer is a little bit simpler than host, so we got that going for us. Let's go to peer. So peer, the very first thing you have to think about is obviously the host is going to be creating certain objects as it initializes it, so you have to handle that. So when the peer, aka your player, is created, because it created it for you, remember, you want to make sure that you do a few things. You want to set the peer ID to the multiplayer peer ID. You want to associate the peer to that peer ID. That's important. That's an important step for your multiplayer plugin. And then there's a whole bunch of other initialization stuff that I do here with visibility and adding children. I also initialize where the camera should go. So when you join, make sure it connects to multiplayer.myid. And remember, the context has changed now. Now you're a peer. So multiplayer.myid means me, and I'm the peer, and I'm in this group. And this is what was enabled, not the host group. So this is the only set of event code that is running. And then also the UFO is getting synced to you. Not the position, but just the creation of it. So when it does get created, there's a few frames of animation on it, so stop the animation and then set the position to the UFO data.getX and getY. And remember, I pass that from the host to the peer when the peer joined as a data structure. And you'll see it down here where it handles that. The other thing that we have to do as the peer, in addition to initialization, is we have to do some client update data, and then simulating local control, and then on-peer messages. So let's go into those. So remember, you as the client, you are basically just providing inputs to the host. They make the decision, and then you respond to the messages that they give back to you. So you have to set up how you're going to send the input data to them. And so you use this on-client update, and this is a really important trigger. So this trigger is what is called right before it sends the information. So you want to collect all of your data and then send it. So the first thing you do is you set your look X and look Y to your mouse position. And then you come down here and you do the same thing that the host kind of did, right? Which is based off of your keys that you've entered, set the bits to either 0 or 1, similar with your left click button and your space bar. And then lastly, if you are inside your text box, ignore that and set it to 0. All right. So now you've set up your client input data. So now every single time it sends it off to the host, it's sending this set of data of your mouse position and your inputs of 0 and 1. And that's what the host, as we just looked at, is using to make all those decisions. And then we want to do some local inputs to simulate the movement kind of ahead of time. Now we're using that input value that we just populated. And if it is one, we're simulating the movement of this. And this makes your game, if you're the peer, just feel more responsive rather than waiting for it to go to the host to simulate the movement, and then for it to sync back to you. You're kind of jumping ahead and trying to do the same movement ahead of time, and there's less movement syncing that has to occur because you're already simulating the motion, and it's accounting for your lag already. And then you have this group called on-peer messages. So this is all the stuff that the host is saying, hey, I made this decision. I need to send it to you so that you can do something with it. So for this one, on seed, it goes ahead and generates its own space map. So remember in the beginning, now whenever you join the game and it sends that seed message to you when you receive it, let's go ahead and generate our own world that looks exactly the same because we've used the advanced random plugin. Similarly to all these different situations, like when a player leaves, you want to update certain things so that you don't see the player anymore. It gets rid of, all the different sprites and it changes your UI appropriately. Also, I have this helper dictionary called player number. That's that whole, like, am I player 2, player 3, player 4? And this just helps similarly manage some of your UI and visibility. And then you've got this UFO helper, which we talked about. So whenever I get this, I'm going to read in the JSON that I received from the multiplayer message into my own UFO data. And that lets me position the UFO appropriately in my game. And then we've got the countdown. So you can just, go ahead and see your own countdown timer. Now on this one, I did trigger their own countdowns because it was only 3 seconds rather than the game timer, which is 5 minutes. I thought really that needed to be synced throughout the course of the game through an instance variable using linear interpolation. And then we've got the game start, and we've got what all needs to happen. Get rid of all the layers that you don't need, turn on the layers that you do want to see, and go ahead and start being able to move your character because you've triggered this boolean to game started to true. And then you've got on peer message dead. So if one of the peers dies, you receive this message, and you also are getting this dead state, which is kind of like a redundant check that's keeping all that information in a dictionary, just in case somebody joins the game partway through. And then you've got this alive. It does the same type of thing. It sets the dead state to false for that particular peer. And if it happens to be you, you take back the camera and put it on your own peer player. And then also this game over event, which does the same thing effectively as the host. So that's all it is for peer. Remember, for the peer, you're really just trying to get the input data to the host, and then the host is making the decision, and you're trying to respond through the messages received from the host to update your game accordingly. So most of the meat sits inside of the host. Now, let's go back here. And we're not going to spend too much time on this because this isn't as important to the multiplayer piece, but there's certain things that you want to do inside of the common that you really just want to think, okay, well, I need to do this in both my host and my peer. And that's where you dump all this stuff. So there's a couple of interesting ones I'll hone in on, such as the mini-map and a few others. So let's jump back into the game and see what that looks like. We have a lot of initialization, as you can imagine, inside of Common. You've got all these visibility things that you're setting. You're resetting some global variables in case it's like the second or third time you've played the game without logging back in. And then you've got these other things you're handling for just the logs so that you can see it on your screen whenever a peer connects or disconnects. You've got this constant update of your mouse.x and mouse.y. Regardless of whether we are the host or the peer, we want our own player to have this always in sync in real time to what my mouse.x and mouse.y actually is. So there's no lag. There doesn't feel like there's any lag from it going up to the host and back down to me. And then, it feels like as I move my mouse around, it's always chasing it rather than just being right on it. Every tick, we want to make sure that certain objects are put on their appropriate layers. Remember, the syncing of certain objects don't always put it onto the appropriate layers, so you want to make sure that you're doing that for anything that's getting synced. And then, coming on down here, there's a few things that we want to make sure that we're taking care of. I mean, this is where we handle making that laser effect and the thrusts. So if your inputs are, a certain way, show these. And that's why on the host we also populated these bits, even though we didn't really need them. It just makes some of the logic down in the comments section easier if you can use those peer inputs as triggers or as ways of filtering out your logic, rather than it having to be special between the peer and the host. Okay, let's jump into the mini-map. That was kind of a fun thing that that we did. So it's just kind of simple. So every tick, effectively, it's looking for each peer, and it actually has this other sprite that it's just mimicking the position of that peer inside of just a smaller box, and that's what this formula does. So as your player rotates, or as that player moves around relatively inside the mini map, it's moving your player in that same position and also adjusting the angle. One of the things that was also kind of cool that I did, that you guys can take a look at some point, is what I did do is when the map is created, I have this canvas that what it will do is it'll actually paste. It'll go through and at first it'll put every meteor that is on the game on the mini map, but that's like another 7,500 objects that I didn't want to leave in the game because that just makes everything more laggy. So I paste all those icons onto this canvas, and then after I have to wait a little bit because you want to make sure that it's actually ticked and it's actually updated the canvas. I go ahead and I destroy all those so that way I just have an image of what all those icons look like. That's just one object rather than like 7,000 some objects. So that's what this is doing. And so that was kind of a fun thing to do on the minimap. Then you've just got some other simple utilities. You want to have like, hey, if I am clicking in the chat box, do certain things. If I click on the leave button, go back to the login. And also some other things to trigger on countdown and some other checks at the very end here, just to make sure that if I am dead or something seems out of whack, it's some final checks, because I was seeing some messages not always get through on my dead and alive. So because I had that redundant dictionary of player dead state, I could do some final checks at the very end and just make sure everything is set up appropriately in case a message didn't get through. I could at least reference this and try to get it back set up correctly. Alright everybody, and that is about as fast as I can cover multiplayer inside of a tutorial. I know it was a long one, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me. If you did enjoy this tutorial, please consider subscribing, giving me the thumbs up, all those good things. Really appreciate it. It's free for you to do, and it makes a big difference for me. So go to my itch page, download it, go through at your own leisure. I know I went through a lot of content quickly, so definitely take the time to go into that event sheet and go through it at your own pace and make derivatives of this game and make something cool with it. Also, feel free to play it with your friends on the itch page itself. And with that said, everybody have a nice day and good luck.